How does a father go from being Hollywood's most beloved storyteller to the subject of a real-life murder mystery that no one, not even Hollywood's most twisted screenwriter, could have imagined? How does a son, one once celebrated for overcoming his demons, end up in a jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, and his legacy shattered? And why, in the hours after the news broke, did the former president of the United States tweet, without evidence, that karma had finally caught up to Rob Reiner? This isn't a script. This isn't a trailer. This is real. Rob Reiner, the iconic director behind When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, Stand By Me, and A Few Good Men, is gone. His wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, gone with him. And the only suspect? Their son, Nicholas Reiner, arrested, detained, and now sentenced. But before we dive into the chilling scene that left 2 bodies in an LA mansion and 1 man behind bars for life, we need to rewind. Because if you want to understand how Hollywood's favorite family became the center of a national firestorm, you need to know the story behind the story. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because this wasn't sudden. This wasn't random. This was a tragedy decades in the making. And now, the world is watching. Let's go back to the beginning. The headlines were merciless. Rob Reiner dead at 77. Wife also found at scene. Nick Reiner arrested in Hollywood double homicide. Trump blames derangement syndrome for Reiner deaths. Within minutes of the news breaking, the internet did what it always does. It exploded. Theories, accusations, finger-pointing. Everyone had a version. No one had the facts. But here's what we do know. On a quiet Wednesday morning, in one of Los Angeles' wealthiest enclaves, neighbors reported hearing a scream. Not a movie scream. Not a playful shriek. A guttural, real, soul-ripping sound. Police arrived within 10 minutes. By then, the gates were already open. The front door? Slightly ajar. Inside, 2 bodies. No sign of forced entry. No weapons visible. No blood spatter on the walls like you might expect in a violent crime scene. Just silence. And a smell that suggested hours had passed since their deaths. Rob and Michelle Reiner were pronounced dead at the scene. And standing just a few feet away, pacing back and forth, sweating, pale, and barely coherent, was Nick, their only son. Now, if you're not familiar with Nick Reiner, you might be wondering, who is he? And what kind of relationship did he have with his parents? You'll find out soon enough. But let's just say, the answer depends on who you ask. To some, Nick was the ultimate redemption story. To others, a ticking time bomb. Either way, no one expected this. Because Rob Reiner wasn't just another celebrity. He wasn't tabloid fodder. He was Hollywood royalty. The son of comedy legend Carl Reiner. The man who brought us heartwarming classics and hard-hitting dramas. The voice of morality in an increasingly polarized America. A vocal opponent of Donald Trump. A tireless political activist. A beloved father figure on and off screen. Rob wasn't just a man. He was an institution. And when an institution falls, it shakes the foundation of everything. But let's zoom out for a moment. Because the minute the news hit the airwaves, people immediately started asking one thing. Why? Why would Nick, someone who'd publicly reconciled with his parents, someone who'd collaborated on films with his father, someone who had seemingly turned his life around, commit such a heinous act? Was it rage? A psychotic break? A betrayal gone wrong? Or was it something more calculated? Financial? Political? Even orchestrated? Because just hours after Rob's death, Donald Trump fired off a tweet that made jaws drop across the country. Rob Reiner and wife reportedly dead due to anger he caused others with his Trump derangement syndrome. Sad, but predictable. Let that sink in. The former president of the United States essentially suggesting that Rob Reiner's death was a form of political karma. And that's where the firestorm began. Because suddenly, this wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a political event. The far right called it justice. The left called it madness. And the middle? They just wanted the truth. But truth, as we'll soon see, is rarely simple. Especially in Hollywood. And especially when family secrets run deep. You see, Nick wasn't just any celebrity child. He wasn't a quiet trust fund kid living in the shadow of his parents. He was loud. He was troubled. And he was famous for not wanting to be famous. He'd battled addiction. He'd been in and out of rehab before he was 18. He'd been arrested, publicly shamed, And then he wrote a movie, Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical film about a drug-addicted teen from a wealthy Hollywood family trying to find redemption. Written by Nick, directed by Rob, produced by Michelle. It was supposed to be their healing moment, a public olive branch, a chance to say, "We've been through hell, but we made it back." And for a while, it seemed like they had. But healing is rarely that simple. And behind the red carpet smiles were years of pain, resentment, and unspoken words. In the days after the arrest, court documents were unsealed, testimonies leaked, audio recordings emerged, and piece by piece, the narrative began to shift. What had been painted as a simple domestic tragedy started to look a lot more like a conspiracy. There were gaps in the police timeline, inconsistencies in Nick's statement, and, perhaps most chilling, signs that someone else may have been involved. Because hours before their death, Rob and Michelle had attended a closed-door meeting with their lawyer, a meeting reportedly about changing the will. And guess who wasn't going to be included in the new version? Nick. Suddenly, motive had a motive, and the son, once seen as a victim of circumstance, became a suspect with a very real reason to lash out. But was he guilty? Was he really the one who pulled the trigger, metaphorically or literally? Or was Nick Reiner a scapegoat, a fall guy? Someone used, once again, as the emotional punching bag for a legacy too heavy to carry? That's what this series is here to explore. Over the next 10-plus chapters, we'll take you into the Reiner household, into courtrooms, behind closed doors, through police records and Hollywood's darkest corners. We'll hear from family friends, former staff, even ex-girlfriends of Nick who say there were always signs. And we'll explore one disturbing question no one wants to ask. What if Nick didn't do it? Because in this town, truth is a slippery thing. And sometimes, the most obvious story is the one planted to distract you. So whether you're here because you admired Rob Reiner, or because you're obsessed with true crime, or because you saw Trump's tweet and thought, "What the hell is going on?" you're in the right place. This isn't a hit piece. It's not a defense. It's a reckoning. Because this story isn't just about a Hollywood family torn apart. It's about the system that raised them, the industry that protected them, and the forces, political, personal, and otherwise, that brought them down. So grab your popcorn. Or maybe, pour yourself a drink. Because what comes next? It's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about fame, family, and forgiveness. And it starts with the forgotten son. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What happens to a child raised in a mansion full of laughter, yet starved of something far more essential, being truly seen? What if your father was America's most beloved storyteller, but never told yours? This is where Nick Reiner's journey begins. Not in a courtroom, not in a police station, not even in a rehab facility, but in the shadows of Hollywood's blinding lights. Because while Rob Reiner was making the world laugh, cry, and believe in fairy tale endings, his son was quietly falling apart, and no one was paying attention, except the demons. From the outside, the Reiner family looked like royalty. Red carpet events, private schools, vacations in the Hamptons, dinner parties with celebrities, politicians, producers, and power players. Nick was born into a world most kids can only imagine. But from the very beginning, there was a crack in the glass. Rob Reiner was at the height of his career when Nick entered the picture. Movie sets, deadlines, campaigns, press tours, and Michelle Singer, Nick's mother, was navigating the dual pressure of being both a creative partner and the wife of one of the most visible men in the country. Nick? He was the background character in a movie he never auditioned for. Let's get real for a second. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? That your pain didn't fit the narrative your family wanted to sell? Now imagine that, but with the entire country watching. Nick wasn't just the son of a celebrity. He was the potential PR disaster in the making. By age 13, he was using, not marijuana, not the occasional drink at a high school party, but hard drugs, heroin, oxy, cocaine. He overdosed before he hit legal driving age. And guess what? The industry knew. You think Hollywood doesn't talk? Agents whispered. Directors gossiped. Executives warned. Keep an eye on the Reiner boy. But in public? Silence. And that silence? It was deadly. In 2015, Nick Reiner co-wrote a film called Being Charlie, a fictionalized retelling of his own addiction and recovery story. Rob directed it. Michelle helped produce. It was supposed to be their redemption arc, a way to turn Nick's trauma into triumph. But behind the scenes, the old wounds were still open. Crew members described the energy on set as tense. Nick would often vanish for hours. There were days of reshoots, scenes rewritten last minute, arguments off camera. One assistant allegedly heard Rob shout, "You're not the victim in this story, Nick." But Nick believed he was. And how could he not? His pain had become their screenplay. His relapse had become their narrative. His trauma turned into content. Here's the thing, though. Being Charlie flopped. It wasn't critically panned. It just didn't connect. Because while it tried to sell recovery as a clean, linear arc, real life is messy. Addiction isn't cured with hugs and Hollywood hugs. And Nick? He was still in it. Still battling. Still slipping. There were whispers of a breakdown in 2017. He vanished from social media. Friends said he wasn't safe to be around. But the Reiner family stayed quiet. And in Hollywood, silence usually means one of two things. A lawsuit is coming, or someone's reputation is on the line. Sometimes both. So what was Nick doing in those missing years? What demons was he still dancing with? And perhaps more importantly, who was enabling them? Because let's not pretend Nick was out there on his own. You don't grow up Reiner rich and go completely unsupervised. Someone was giving him money, covering up his mistakes, whispering to publicists to kill stories. And that someone might have had their own secrets to protect. Here's something you won't hear on TMZ. Nick once told a former friend, who later leaked the quote, that he felt like a liability with a trust fund. A walking contradiction. Too dangerous to keep close. Too rich to let go. Sound familiar? That's the kind of resentment that doesn't just boil. It simmers, quietly, for years, until one day, it erupts. And when it does, people die. But here's the twist. Just a few months before the murder, Nick had seemingly pulled his life together again. He'd moved back in with Rob and Michelle. Friends said he was present. He was attending therapy, trying to write again. There were even rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that he'd been offered a consulting deal on a new Netflix series about addiction recovery. Rob and Michelle were supportive. They wanted to believe in him. They needed to believe in him. Because what parent wants to admit that your child might be the one thing you can't fix? But that facade, it was paper thin. The pressure of expectations. The ghost of past failures. The house full of memories and regrets. It was all crashing down on Nick. And it's worth asking, because no one in the press has. Was moving back into that house the biggest mistake of his life? Or was it someone else's? We'll continue with the second half of Chapter 1, where we dive deeper into Nick's last days of freedom, the strange behavior witnesses noticed, and a troubling visit he made just 72 hours before his parents were found dead. Because the signs were there, but no one connected the dots, until it was far too late. What if the warning signs weren't subtle at all? What if they were loud, frantic, practically screaming to be noticed? And what if the people closest to Nick Reiner saw them, but convinced themselves it was just another phase? Because in the final days before everything collapsed, Nick wasn't hiding. He was unraveling in plain sight. 72 hours. That's all that stood between normalcy and catastrophe. 72 hours before police tape wrapped around the Reiner property. 72 hours before Rob and Michelle's names would scroll across news tickers. 72 hours before Nick's face would be plastered on screens with one word beneath it. Suspect. According to multiple witnesses, Nick spent those final days moving like a man running out of time. Not frantic, not manic, but deliberate, calculated. And that's what made people uneasy. On Sunday night, Nick showed up unannounced at a small recovery meeting in West Hollywood. No cameras, no press, no celebrity crowd, just folding chairs and coffee that tasted like regret. A woman who attended that meeting later told investigators something chilling. Nick didn't speak much. He listened, but when he did talk, he asked one question over and over. What happens if you can't fix what you broke? Not metaphorically, literally. People assumed he was talking about addiction, about relapses, about burned bridges. But now, that question sounds very different. The next morning, Nick visited an old friend from rehab, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. According to that friend, Nick arrived early, too early, sat on the couch, didn't touch his coffee, and then said something that still keeps that friend up at night. I think they're afraid of me, Nick allegedly said. They meaning Rob and Michelle. afraid of their own son. Let that sink in. What kind of tension has to exist for parents, wealthy, powerful, protected, to fear the child they raised? And more importantly, why now? Here's where the story takes a darker turn. That same day, Nick requested access to financial documents, trust paperwork, estate details, bank statements. This wasn't speculation. This came directly from a legal assistant who worked with the Reiners' longtime attorney. Nick wasn't yelling, wasn't demanding. He was polite, almost calm. But when told the documents couldn't be released without Rob and Michelle's approval, his demeanor changed. Not angry, cold. And before leaving, he reportedly said, "Then I guess I'll hear it from them directly." That night, neighbors noticed raised voices coming from the Reiner house. Not shouting, but intense, measured. The kind of argument where every word is chosen carefully, because both sides know exactly where to strike. One neighbor later told police, "It didn't sound like a fight. It sounded like negotiations." Negotiations between parents and son. About what? Money? Control? Boundaries? Fear? No one outside those walls knows for sure. But we do know this. The Reiners had scheduled a meeting with their attorney the very next morning. A meeting Nick wasn't invited to. And now comes the part that makes investigators uneasy. Because when police reconstructed the timeline, they found a gap. A missing hour. An hour where Nick's phone was off. No GPS. No texts. No calls. Just silence. When his phone came back online, it pinged near the Reiner home. And shortly after that, everything went dark. Let's talk about Nick's behavior after the deaths. Because grief has patterns. Shock has patterns. And so does guilt. When first responders arrived, Nick wasn't hysterical. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't collapsing. He was detached. According to one officer's report, Nick repeatedly asked, "Are they already gone?" Not, "Are they okay?" Not, "Can you save them?" Already gone. Finality. And then there was this moment, small, but telling. As paramedics worked on Michelle, Nick reportedly turned away. Didn't watch. Didn't plead. Just walked into the hallway and sat down. Hands folded. Waiting. For what? Later, during questioning, Nick's story stayed consistent. Too consistent. Same words. Same phrasing. Same pauses. As if rehearsed. Investigators noticed he avoided one topic entirely. The argument the night before. When asked about it, Nick said, "We talked about a lot of things. Nothing important. Nothing important." But people don't raise their voices at midnight over nothing. Especially not families with everything to lose. And then came the evidence that sealed Nick's fate, at least in the eyes of the public. Traces of medication in his system. Prescriptions that weren't his. A history of instability. And a narrative that fit too neatly. Troubled son. Wealthy parents. Breaking point. Case closed. Or so it seemed. But here's the contradiction no one wants to address. If Nick planned this, why stay? Why call 911? Why not run? People with money run all the time. They disappear. They lawyer up. They flee the country. Nick did none of that. He waited. Cooperated. Almost expected it. As if, on some level, he believed this was inevitable. That no matter what happened, he'd be the one blamed. And maybe that belief didn't come from nowhere. Because for most of his life, Nick Reiner had been the problem. The liability. The footnote. The son Hollywood loved to forget. So when tragedy struck, everyone already knew where to point. But what if that's exactly why this case is so dangerous? Because sometimes, the most convenient suspect is the one everyone stops questioning. As Nick sat in custody, the world debated his guilt. But behind closed doors, investigators were already uncovering inconsistencies. Details that didn't add up. Evidence that didn't fit the narrative. And whispers, quiet at first, that someone else had been involved. Because the deeper they dug, the more it seemed like Nick wasn't the architect of the tragedy, but a piece on someone else's board. And if that's true, then the question isn't just what Nick did, it's who benefited. And that question leads us straight into the next chapter. Because to understand what really happened in that house, we need to understand the man at the center of it all. Not the son, the father. Rob Reiner wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a political force. And powerful forces make powerful enemies. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What happens when a Hollywood director stops telling fairy tales and starts declaring war? What happens when a man once beloved for love stories and coming-of-age classics becomes a political lightning rod loathed by half the country. Rob Reiner made a career out of telling stories people would remember, but his political crusades made him unforgettable for very different reasons. And now, some are wondering, did those crusades get him killed? Let's rewind. Long before there were murder headlines and conspiracy threads on Reddit, there were Twitter wars, and Rob Reiner was always in the trenches, unapologetic, unfiltered, and unrelenting in his criticism of Donald J. Trump. While many Hollywood celebrities dipped their toes into politics, Reiner jumped in headfirst, fully clothed, middle fingers raised. From the moment Trump descended that golden escalator in 2015, Rob was firing off tweets like a man with nothing to lose. Donald Trump is a pathologically lying, misogynistic, racist, anti-Semitic sociopath. What else do you need to know? That was just one of hundreds. His timeline, a digital battlefield. He didn't just disagree with Trump. He believed Trump was a threat to democracy, and he said it over and over and over again. But Rob wasn't just tweeting. He was organizing. In 2017, he co-founded the committee to investigate Russia, alongside James Clapper and Charles Sykes. That's right. While the Mueller investigation was unfolding, Rob Reiner was out there pushing for full exposure of Trump's alleged ties to Russia. Videos, campaigns, PSAs narrated by Morgan Freeman. This was an amateur hour. This was a full-on resistance. And it made waves. But not everyone applauded. Because every time Rob made a statement, he made an enemy. Behind the scenes, Reiner was getting death threats. Not occasionally, regularly. Anonymous voicemails, emails filled with racial slurs, letters mailed directly to his production office. Some were vague, others were graphic, all of them disturbing. At one point, according to someone close to the Reiner family, the LAPD had to sweep their property twice in a single month due to credible threats. And yet, he never backed down. In interviews, Rob laughed it off. People are angry. That's how you know you're hitting a nerve. But hitting nerves has consequences. And some of those consequences don't show up until years later. Let's talk about Trump himself. Because while Rob was launching campaigns and firing off tweets, Trump noticed. And Trump hit back. Not with policies, not with press conferences, but with his weapon of choice, Twitter. Meathead Rob Reiner is at it again. All talk, no talent. Just another washed-up Hollywood liberal. That was one of many. Sometimes Rob responded. Sometimes he ignored it. But the feud escalated. In 2020, Reiner called Trump's handling of the pandemic criminal. In 2021, he accused Trump of orchestrating an insurrection. Each time, Trump's base responded in kind. Memes, mockery, threats. Some targeted Rob directly. Others targeted his family. Here's a detail few have reported. A week before Rob and Michelle were found dead, Rob received a direct message from an anonymous account. The message was short. 8 words. You should have kept your mouth shut. Chilling? Absolutely. Investigated? Reportedly, yes. But by then, it was too late. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. The tweet. The one that detonated the internet. The one sent by Donald J. Trump, just hours after Rob's death was confirmed. Rob Reiner and wife reportedly dead due to anger he caused others with his Trump derangement syndrome. Sad, but predictable. No condolences. No pause for empathy. Just a veiled accusation. And whether Trump intended it or not, that tweet lit the match. Suddenly, Reiner's death wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a political Rorschach test. The right said, he got what he asked for. The left said, this is dangerous rhetoric. The middle? They weren't sure what to believe. Because how do you explain a death that feels like prophecy? Now, was Trump directly responsible? No evidence says that. Did he incite violence? That's debatable. But what's undeniable is this. Rob Reiner lived the last decade of his life making powerful enemies. Not in backroom studios or behind closed casting calls, but on cable news, on social media, on the national stage. He wasn't just challenging a politician. He was challenging an ideology. And that ideology had millions of followers. Some of them unhinged. Some of them armed. And some of them convinced that Rob Reiner was more than just a filmmaker. He was the enemy. Which brings us to the bigger question. Was Nick Reiner the only person who had a motive? Or did Rob's politics make him a target long before his son ever walked through that front door? Because the autopsy reports were clean. No forced entry. No signs of a robbery. No obvious struggle. It was as if someone had been let in, someone expected, or someone too powerful to be stopped. In the next section, we'll dive into the walls of the Reiner home, where secrets lived just beneath the surface. Because politics wasn't the only pressure Rob was under. There were rumors of fights, talk of mistrust, and a family dynamic that had grown increasingly volatile in recent years. Hollywood applauded Rob Reiner, but inside his own home, things weren't quite so harmonious. And what happened in that house on that final night might reveal more about the killer than any courtroom ever could. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when the voices cheering for you on stage start whispering behind closed doors? Rob Reiner had millions of fans, but in Hollywood, applause doesn't always mean protection, especially when your politics get louder than your pictures. And for Rob, they did. Let's take a closer look at the final years of Rob Reiner's life, not as a director, but as a man surrounded by allies who were slowly turning into liabilities. Because here's something that doesn't get mentioned enough. The entertainment industry pretends to love rebellion until it threatens revenue. And Rob Reiner? He became radioactive, not because of a scandal, not because of personal misconduct, but because he refused to play it safe. He attacked Trump. He attacked Fox News. He attacked anyone who stood in the way of what he believed was truth. To fans, he was a hero. To some in the business, he was a headache. According to several insiders who spoke anonymously, Rob began losing meetings by 2018. Studio executives, some of whom he'd worked with for decades, stopped returning calls. There were projects in development that mysteriously never progressed. Distributors got cold feet. One former assistant reportedly heard a major exec say, "Rob's great, but he's too loud right now. We need safe content." Safe content, a phrase that says everything and nothing at the same time. Reiner had built a career on telling brave stories. But now, those stories were being overshadowed by his political fire. And it wasn't just the industry. Friends were beginning to fall away. Former collaborators grew distant, not because they disagreed with his views, but because they feared association. Because in the new Hollywood, being too political could make you unemployable. One producer, once close with Rob, reportedly stopped inviting him to fundraisers. Another allegedly told Michelle in private, "I love Rob, but I can't have him at my table. Not right now." Imagine that. You spend your life building a reputation, only to be treated like a liability for using your voice. That kind of betrayal? It cuts deeper than most people realize. And through it all, Michelle watched it happen. Michelle Singer Reiner wasn't just Rob's wife. She was his creative partner, his sounding board, his emotional compass. Sources say she often urged Rob to pull back, to let the work speak louder than the tweets. But Rob couldn't help himself. He believed the stakes were too high. Trump wasn't just a political opponent to Rob. He was a symptom of a system Reiner felt morally obligated to expose. And Michelle? She stood by him, at least publicly. But privately, the cracks were starting to show. Family friends recall increasing tension in the Reiner home. Arguments that lasted hours. Whispers behind closed doors. Michelle allegedly urging Rob to scale back, focus on family, especially Nick. She was worried, not just about the threats, the career backlash, or the press, but about Nick. And what the escalating chaos was doing to him. Because while Rob was fighting wars on social media, Nick was spiraling again. And Michelle? She was caught in the middle. One friend recalled a particularly tense dinner in early 2023. The Reiners hosted a small group, just 6 people. During a heated debate over a new political ad Rob was producing, Nick allegedly stormed out, slammed his glass down, said nothing, left. Michelle followed. What happened in that hallway is still unknown. But the silence afterward said more than words ever could. Because by the time they returned to the table, Rob looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 minutes. And Michelle? She didn't say another word the rest of the night. Let's take a step back. Because it's important to understand something. Rob wasn't just an outspoken liberal. He was a strategic one. He funded campaigns, bankrolled documentaries, met with lawmakers behind closed doors. He used his fame not to charm, but to confront. And in doing so, he attracted attention, not just from the right-wing media, but from shadowy corners of the internet. Conspiracy blogs, anonymous forums, fringe networks. Some started tracking his movements. One site published a bizarre map of elite homes to watch. Rob's was on the list. Another shared his speaking schedule. This wasn't political disagreement. This was obsession. And yet, the LAPD never confirmed an official threat against Rob's life. Why? Because threats in 2024 didn't come in envelopes or calls anymore. They came in the form of viral outrage, coordinated dog piles, online mobs. It's easier than ever to radicalize someone into believing a public figure deserves punishment. And Rob Reiner, in their eyes, had committed the ultimate sin. He wouldn't shut up. Now here's the twist. Some believe that the murder of Rob and Michelle wasn't about Nick at all, that he was manipulated, coerced, or even set up to take the fall for something far more sinister. Because when you follow the money, when you follow the enemies, when you follow the silence that followed their deaths, you don't just find a broken family. You find a chilling pattern, a man too loud for Hollywood, a message too dangerous for power, and a death that, despite being called a domestic tragedy, felt more like an execution. And here's where things really get dark. Days after Rob's death, his emails were leaked. Not all of them, just a few, but enough. Enough to suggest he was preparing a new campaign. One that involved classified materials leaked from a political whistleblower. One that targeted elite donors tied to multiple administrations. One that could have rocked both the political left and right. The campaign was reportedly called The Curtain. Michelle was helping write the script. And Nick? Well, he wasn't mentioned at all. Which raises the question, did someone else want that script buried? And if so, how far would they go to make that happen? In the next chapter, we leave the politics behind and step through the front doors of the Reiner home. Because public enemies and political agendas aside, there was something rotting within the family itself. Power. Secrets. A slow unraveling hidden behind closed gates and perfect hedges. And the people who knew Rob best? They now admit, things inside the house weren't as perfect as the world believed. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What do you see when you picture the Reiner residence? A sprawling Hollywood Hills mansion with manicured gardens, framed movie posters, and laughter echoing through sunlit hallways? That's what the public imagined. The truth was quieter, colder, heavier. Because beneath the polished floors and designer decor, the Reiner home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker, and the people inside were running out of time. The Reiner house sat at the end of a secluded cul-de-sac in Brentwood, gated, guarded, and insulated from the outside world. On the surface, it was pristine, but neighbors had their suspicions. A woman who walked her dog past the house daily said she often heard sharp words through the windows. Another claimed she saw Nick pacing the garden late at night, muttering to himself. And more than one delivery driver recalled being greeted at the door not by staff, but by Rob. Red-eyed, impatient, curt. This wasn't the image of the jovial director America adored. This was something else. Something fractured. Inside, the walls told stories. Dozens of framed family photos. Rob's Emmys and awards sat atop shelves dusted weekly by a quiet housekeeper who rarely spoke English. The grand piano in the foyer hadn't been touched in years. But perhaps most unsettling? The guest room was permanently set up as Nick's bedroom, not a visiting son's casual crash pad. A fully furnished, lived-in space. Nick had moved back in, again, just months before the tragedy. But according to a staff member, he never really unpacked. He lived out of suitcases, kept his closet sparse, and left his door locked, even when he was inside. Let's talk about that. Because when your grown child locks themselves away inside your multi-million-dollar home, that's not just privacy, that's distance. And that distance was growing wider by the day. Family friends later admitted the dynamic between Rob, Michelle, and Nick had grown tense beyond repair. Michelle was trying, always the peacemaker. She believed Nick could be saved, that his anger came from pain, that the addiction wasn't who he was, just something he carried. But Rob? He had limits. According to sources, Rob had reached a breaking point. He reportedly told a friend on a phone call, "I can't keep cleaning up after him. He's 30. He's got to want to live." That line would be echoed by prosecutors in court. And then, there was the money. Because behind every Hollywood family meltdown is a ledger with too many zeros. Nick had access to a trust, not the full inheritance, just enough to survive. But he wanted more. In the months before Rob and Michelle's deaths, Nick had allegedly made multiple requests to release early access to additional funds. His reasoning? A new business venture. One friend claimed it was a media startup focused on addiction recovery, but another said it was just a front to cover debts, possibly even gambling losses. Rob said no. Not once, not twice, 3 times. And each time, the rejection cut deeper. Michelle, on the other hand, was caught in the middle. She'd always played the diplomat, but even she was cracking. One of her close friends claimed Michelle had recently begun seeing a therapist on her own for the first time in over a decade. She confessed she felt trapped, that she was constantly choosing between her son and her husband, that Rob was hardening, and Nick was slipping, and she just wanted peace. Now, let's talk about the night routines. Because in households under stress, bedtime becomes a battleground. Staff noticed that dinner was no longer shared. Rob often ate alone in his study, Michelle at the kitchen counter. Nick, rarely seen. One night, a housekeeper heard a muffled argument. Not yelling, but low, seething. Rob allegedly told Nick, "You either live here as our son, or you leave here as a stranger." That line lingered in the air like smoke. And the next morning, Nick didn't come down for breakfast. Michelle looked exhausted. And Rob? He was late for a meeting he never missed. There's something haunting about the silence in a house after a fight. Even the furniture seems to flinch. The days that followed were eerily quiet. No visitors. No calls taken on speakerphone. No laughter from the living room. Nick was inside. But emotionally, he was already gone. Some say he was depressed. Others say he was scheming. Either way, he wasn't at peace. And the people closest to him were starting to notice. The most telling moment came just days before the deaths. According to one housekeeper, Michelle pulled her aside and asked, quietly, almost in a whisper, "Have you ever been afraid of someone you love?" The woman didn't know how to respond. Michelle smiled, shook her head as if to wave it off, and went back upstairs. That question would echo in the trial, in the press, in the minds of everyone who knew them. Because when a mother asks that question, it means something is already very, very wrong. In the next section, we explore the final 24 hours inside the Reiner home. What they ate, who they spoke to, and what one neighbor saw that might just unravel the entire timeline. Because sometimes, the truth isn't in the grand gestures. It's in the smallest, quietest moments no one thought mattered. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Can a family collapse in just 24 hours? Or does the final day merely reveal the damage that was already done? Because what happened inside the Reiner home in the hours leading up to Rob and Michelle's deaths wasn't just strange. It was a crescendo, built on years of silence, resentment, and one impossible decision. And it began with dinner. Thursday, 7:03 p.m. DoorDash logs show a food order placed from an upscale Mediterranean restaurant. Salmon, rice pilaf, hummus, 2 cucumber lemonades. The name on the order? Michelle. It was delivered at 7:28 p.m. A housekeeper later testified she set the food out on the kitchen counter, but none of it was touched. None. Plates remained clean. Cups empty. The smell of lemon and herbs wafted through a house already too quiet. Which begs the question, why order dinner for 2 if no one planned to eat? At 7:45 p.m., according to police-verified Ring doorbell footage from a neighbor's home, a black vehicle pulled into the Reiner driveway. Unmarked. Tinted windows. Nick had returned. He'd been out for nearly 6 hours. Where did he go? We'll get to that. What matters here is what happened when he came back. Or, more accurately, what didn't happen. No one opened the door to greet him. No one walked out to meet him. For nearly 5 minutes, Nick sat in the car, still, staring at the house. When he finally entered, he was carrying a small bag. Its contents? Still under seal in court records. 8:12 p.m. A neighbor walking their dog hears muffled shouting through an upstairs window. 3 distinct voices. Male, female, and another male, angrier, louder. Likely Nick. The words weren't clear, but the tone was hostile, final. Then silence. No slamming doors. No glass shattering. No screaming. Just silence. Around 9:06 p.m., Michelle sends a text to her sister in New York. Rough night. We'll call tomorrow. Love you. A text that would never be followed up. Investigators later discovered she also attempted to call a friend around that time, twice. Both calls went unanswered. It's unclear whether she left a voicemail. But here's what's chilling. The phone went dark after that. No outgoing messages. No received calls. Nothing. as if whatever she feared had just arrived. Let's pause here, because here's where things get weird. At 10:18 p.m., Nick Reiner's phone connected to the home Wi-Fi for the first time in hours. But he wasn't streaming. He wasn't texting. He was accessing the Reiner family's home security system. Logs show he reviewed live feeds and toggled the system settings. For nearly 8 minutes, Nick was reviewing interior camera angles. But oddly, none of the footage from that night was saved. Why? Because sometime during those 8 minutes, all recording settings were turned off. Manually. No password required, because Nick had the admin code. Just after 11 p.m., a neighbor reported seeing flickering lights from one of the upstairs rooms, like a strobe. Possibly a lamp being turned on and off. No shouting, just flashes of movement. And then nothing. The house fell dark. Even the porch light was off, a rare occurrence, according to neighbors. The Reiners almost never turned off exterior lights at night. It was one of Michelle's routines. Her way of keeping the house welcoming, she'd once said. That night, the house didn't welcome anyone. Sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., Rob and Michelle Reiner were killed. No signs of forced entry. No loud struggle. No neighbors awakened. Whatever happened quietly, which only deepens the mystery. Because Rob was a large man, over 6 feet tall, not easily overpowered, not easily surprised. So what happened? Was he asleep? Was he drugged? Toxicology reports found trace sedatives in both victims' systems, but not enough to cause death. Enough to weaken? Perhaps. But how did it get there? That answer may lie in that untouched dinner. By 2:12 a.m., Nick Reiner's phone was no longer on Wi-Fi. By 2:34 a.m., he sent a single text to an unknown number. It's done. That message, retrieved by investigators, was later deemed contextually ambiguous. But the timing couldn't be ignored, because at 3:17 a.m., Nick called 911. His voice was trembling, controlled, not panicked. "They're not breathing. I need help." When asked if there had been a break-in, Nick replied, "No, I was just in my room. I didn't hear anything." But remember, this is the same room where he manually disabled the cameras, where he was seen hours earlier carrying a mysterious bag inside the house, where a locked door would give him the perfect alibi, if only there hadn't been that text. It's done. First responders arrived at 3:29 a.m., found the front door closed, lights off, house silent. Rob was on the couch in his study. Michelle was upstairs in the master bedroom. Both were already gone. No defensive wounds. No trauma to suggest a violent struggle. But both showed signs of pressure applied at the neck. Strangulation. Murder. Premeditated. Nick was taken into custody shortly after sunrise. He didn't fight. Didn't argue. Just stood up, hands outstretched, as if he'd been expecting it. His only question? "Can I change clothes first?" Officers allowed him to. And here's the detail that sent chills down every spine in that room. He changed into the same hoodie he wore the night he returned home. Blood-free, clean, pressed, almost like it had never been worn. The Reiner home was sealed for investigation. Detectives combed through every drawer, every camera, every inch of carpet. They found inconsistencies, empty pill bottles, traces of sedatives in the trash, and one thing that made every hair stand on end. A sheet of paper tucked beneath Michelle's nightstand. One sentence, handwritten. "He needs help, but I'm afraid." No date, no signature, but it was in her handwriting, and that was enough. In the next chapter, we'll walk through that crime scene, step by step, because even though the house was quiet, it was speaking, through footprints, through fingerprints, through things that were missing. And it's there, inside that silence, that the Real story begins to take shape. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does a house look like moments after innocence dies? Not the staged version we see in TV dramas, but the raw, stripped reality of a family home turned into a silent witness. The Reiner residence was no longer a mansion. It had become a crime scene. And the walls? They remembered everything. Let's start with the first responders. When LAPD officers arrived at the Brentwood estate, they expected a medical emergency. A possible overdose. Maybe a suicide. What they walked into instead was a controlled silence that made the hairs on the back of their necks rise. No alarms blaring. No signs of a break-in. No overturned furniture. No blood trails or broken glass. Everything was in its place. two in place, which, for seasoned investigators, was the first red flag. Because when something this violent happens, there's usually a mess. But the Reiner house? It looked like it had been curated. Rob Reiner was found in his study, slumped in the leather chair where he'd written some of his best screenplays. His glasses lay on the desk, still intact, laptop open, blank document on screen. A half-finished cup of black coffee sat to his right, cold but untouched. No visible bruising, no blood, just a pale discoloration on his neck, consistent with manual strangulation. There were no signs of a struggle, which raised a disturbing possibility. Had Rob been caught off guard? Or worse, had he trusted the person who killed him? Upstairs, Michelle's body was discovered on the bed, clothed, covered partially with a blanket, a nightstand lamp still on, a book open on the last page. She'd been reading. Investigators later said it looked as though she had simply gone to sleep, except for the faint bruising on her throat and the slight indentation on the mattress beside her. Someone had been sitting there, watching her, waiting. That was the question investigators asked themselves over and over. Because if Michelle had time to be aware, why hadn't she fought back? No defensive wounds, no broken nails, just that handwritten note, discovered later in the search, saying, "He needs help, but I'm afraid." Haunting, almost prophetic. The rest of the house was nearly spotless, almost too spotless. No clothes in the laundry, no dishes in the sink, no garbage bags near the bin. It was as if the house had been cleaned. Professionally, forensically, this wasn't the natural chaos of daily life. This was calculated order, which led investigators to suspect one thing. The killer had time, and whoever it was knew the layout intimately. Let's talk about the security system. The Reiners had a high-end surveillance setup, multiple internal and external cameras, motion sensors, smart locks, all of it linked to a secure server and accessible via a central control panel. And as we learned in the previous chapter, someone had disabled that system manually. At 10:18 p.m., logs show all internal camera feeds were paused, motion triggers disabled, notifications silenced, no alarms, no backups, no cloud uploads. The footage from that night? Gone. Just gone. Unless it was saved somewhere else. Somewhere off-grid. And here's where things get weirder. The security logs also showed one more access attempt. At 3:02 a.m., someone reactivated the motion sensors. But only for the front porch camera. Why? That question kept detectives up for nights. Why only that camera? Was someone trying to stage an image of normalcy? To make it seem like the system had always been on? Or was it a mistake? A slip? The kind of thing someone does when they're scrambling to cover their tracks. The kind of thing Nick Reiner might do. Forensic teams combed the scene. No foreign fingerprints. No unknown DNA. No signs of forced entry. Every door was locked from the inside. Windows sealed. Alarm systems deactivated before the deaths occurred. In other words, there was no outsider. This was an inside job. And all signs pointed to the same conclusion. The killer was already in the house. Then came the most damning piece of evidence. A partial thumbprint, left on the inside of the master bedroom door. Not Nick's. Not Michelle's. Not Rob's. It belonged to someone else. Someone still unidentified. But here's the twist. It had been wiped. Not fully. Not properly. But there were faint swirls around the print, suggesting someone had tried to erase it and failed. And that opened up a whole new theory. Was Nick working alone? Or had someone helped him? A hired accomplice? A manipulative third party? A stranger let in by the family? Trusted? Welcomed? And if so, where were they now? In the guest room, Nick's quarters, detectives found something strange. 2 sets of gloves. 1 pair in the closet. Another in the bathroom drawer. Both black. Both latex. Both unused. But in the trash? A crumpled receipt from a supply store in Santa Monica. Timestamped 11:45 a.m., the same day of the murders. Purchased by someone using cash. 1 item circled in red ink. Cleaning solvent, industrial grade. Why would someone staying at home, with no job, need that? And why didn't Rob or Michelle know? Or did they? And they just didn't think it meant anything. Until it was too late. The entire crime scene had the feel of a movie set just after the final take. Still, staged, suspended in time. But one scene was missing, one final, emotional puzzle piece. The dog. Yes, the Reiners had a dog. A golden retriever named Molly. beloved, loyal, protective. But on the night of the murder, she wasn't in the house. She was found the next morning, locked in the garage. No food, no water, whimpering. And that alone was perhaps the biggest clue. Because Rob never locked Molly away. Unless he was afraid she might get in the way. In the next section, we go deeper. Into the autopsy reports. Into the toxicology screens. Into the small, eerie details that prosecutors used to paint Nick Reiner as a cold-blooded killer. But we'll also explore what doesn't add up. Because some of the evidence just doesn't make sense. And the truth might be darker and more orchestrated than anyone first believed. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Do the dead speak? Maybe not in words, but in bruises, in toxins, in the quiet chaos of a home turned upside down in perfect silence. And when the autopsy reports came in, Rob and Michelle Reiner were speaking loud and clear. The problem? Not everyone agreed on what they were saying. The official cause of death for both Rob and Michelle Reiner was ruled asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. There were no knife wounds, no blunt force trauma, no gunshot residue, no signs of defensive struggle. And yet something was off. The coroner's report revealed trace amounts of sedatives in both victims. Low doses, not fatal, but enough to slow a heartbeat, to dull reaction time, to make a person compliant. Investigators believe the sedatives were administered through food or drink. Remember that untouched Mediterranean dinner? It suddenly became central to the timeline. The salmon, the rice, the untouched lemonade, all of it, laced. Toxicology screens identified the sedative as zolpidem, better known by its brand name, Ambien, prescribed for insomnia. Not unusual, but neither Rob nor Michelle had a valid prescription. Nick did. That alone wouldn't raise alarms. What did was the dosage. The Reiners had enough in their system to indicate double the average single dose, and they hadn't been prescribed anything for sleep in over 5 years. So where did it come from? The prescription in Nick's name had been filled just 10 days earlier. And here's where it gets darker. According to pharmacy records, the prescription was filled using Rob's insurance card, a detail prosecutors latched onto like a shark smelling blood. Intent, premeditation, access, motivation, all tied to one name, Nick Reiner. But if the sedatives were used to subdue, why weren't there signs of resistance at all? Because even a groggy person will instinctively resist strangulation. Yet there were no broken fingernails, no hair follicles under their nails, no bruises on the attacker's forearms. Could Nick have smothered them instead? Pressed a pillow down with careful pressure? That theory was floated, until a fragment of broken cartilage in Rob's throat dismissed it. This wasn't suffocation. This was force, but applied with precision, which led to a chilling question in the minds of investigators. Had Nick been practicing? In Nick's bedroom, under the bed, police found a tightly rolled towel, knotted at both ends. It matched the size and shape of ligature tools used in restraint training. Why was it there? He never offered an explanation. Neither did his legal team. But a former friend told reporters something that shook the court during pretrial hearings. Nick once joked that if he ever wanted to make someone disappear, he'd use a towel. No fingerprints. No mess. The friend later said they never took it seriously. But now, they weren't so sure. Still, there were inconsistencies. And in a case this high profile, inconsistencies don't just matter. They can make or break the whole thing. Let's walk through them. Inconsistency number 1, the timeline. Prosecutors claim the murders happened between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. But a neighbor's smart doorbell picked up motion near the Reiner's back gate at 1:37 a.m. A silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying what appeared to be a duffel bag. The footage was grainy. No face visible. Nick was already in the house by then, allegedly preparing to make the 911 call. So who was that? A second suspect? Or someone helping clean up? That figure has never been identified. Inconsistency number 2, the missing item. In Michelle's jewelry box, a single item was missing. A gold locket containing a photo of her, Rob, and baby Nick, engraved with the phrase, "Still us." It was her most cherished possession. She wore it daily. And yet, it wasn't found on her. Wasn't in the safe. Wasn't among the recovered jewelry. It had vanished. Why? Some speculated it had sentimental value to Nick. Others believed it was taken by a third party as a trophy. No fingerprints. No trace. Gone. Like a ghost. Inconsistency number 3. The dog. Molly, the Reiner's golden retriever, was locked in the garage. She wasn't drugged. She wasn't injured. She wasn't barking when police arrived. Why? Golden retrievers are notoriously alert, protective, loud. Yet Molly was quiet, calm, subdued. Veterinary staff who later examined her said she was unusually passive, as if she'd been trained to stay silent. Who would do that? Rob wouldn't. Michelle wouldn't. And Nick? He'd been living with her for months. But here's the most damning evidence prosecutors presented in the pretrial motion. A note, written in Rob's handwriting, found in his study drawer. It read, "Nick needs more help than we can give. It's time to draw the line. No date, no context, but paired with Michelle's note, he needs help. But I'm afraid." The message felt like a final plea. To cut Nick off. To stop enabling. To protect themselves. A plea never fulfilled. Still, there was one major hole in the prosecution's case. No direct witness. No one saw Nick commit the crime. No security footage captured the moment. No weapon was ever recovered. All they had was a mountain of circumstantial evidence. And a single text. "It's done." Nick's defense team argued that text was taken out of context. He'd sent it to a friend regarding a script he was writing. They even produced draft pages, dark, violent, eerily similar to the crime. Was it fiction or confession? That was the question. In the end, the crime scene offered more questions than answers. Too clean, too silent, too controlled. Was Nick a genius manipulator, or just the perfect scapegoat? Because the sedatives, the wiped fingerprints, the reprogrammed cameras, they required more than just access. They required planning and help. So the question remains, if Nick didn't act alone, who did? And why are they still out there? In the next chapter, we unravel motive. Because every killer has one, whether it's money, revenge, power, or desperation. And in Nick's case, prosecutors claimed they had all 4. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What drives a son to murder his own parents? Is it anger? Resentment? Or something darker, more calculated? And in Nick Reiner's case, was this a crime of passion or premeditation? We know the facts. We know the evidence. But what we don't know is what was happening inside Nick's mind. Was he acting out of pure madness? Or was this a cold, calculated plan, one designed to manipulate everyone around him? The more you dig, the more the line between the two blurs. But let's start with what we do know. Nick Reiner had always been a ticking time bomb. It wasn't a surprise to anyone who'd followed his tumultuous life. By the time he was 16, he had already cycled through rehab programs, legal issues, and rehab programs again. And that was before he ever stepped foot on a movie set or attended a red carpet event. When you're the son of a Hollywood legend, all eyes are on you. But no one warned Nick that being the only child of one of the industry's most iconic directors would become his prison. He never wanted the spotlight. He was never comfortable in it. And he made that clear by withdrawing further and further from the public eye. But the truth was, Nick wasn't just withdrawing from the world. He was withdrawing from his family, from his parents. His relationship with Rob, in particular, had always been complicated. Rob Reiner's career was built on relationships with celebrities, actors, and politicians. But his son? Nick was a different breed altogether. Not a nepotism child. Not someone who sought validation from his father's fame. But someone who wanted to escape it all. To disappear. To be someone else. And that desire to escape only deepened with age. Now, consider the last few years of Rob and Michelle's lives. In 2019, just 2 years before their deaths, the Reiners had planned a family vacation to Hawaii. Nick didn't go. He said he didn't want to be dragged around like an accessory. His absence wasn't a shock to anyone who knew him well. Nick had a reputation for disappearing when things got too real, when family obligations became too demanding. But this time, it was different. Rob and Michelle had begun to seriously question their son's future. Would he ever truly recover? Or would he always be this lost boy, running away from every chance at redemption? And maybe that question planted a seed of fear. What happens when a parent realizes their child might never be okay? When they're not just afraid of losing them, but of the potential loss. Because here's the thing about Rob Reiner. He wasn't just an artist. He was a father who would have done anything to protect his family. But the closer you get to someone like that, the harder it is to see the cracks in their persona. And Rob was not immune to the strain of a child who couldn't be fixed. So, when Nick began showing signs of erratic behavior, again, Rob made an executive decision. He started drawing lines. In early 2023, Rob reached out to their family lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, about revising the family trust. The new will would essentially cut off Nick. Not completely, but it would limit his access to funds. It would establish clear boundaries. Was it out of love? Out of fear? Or a little of both? We may never know. But what's clear is that Rob had decided something needed to change. Something had to break. This brings us back to the night of the murder. Motive 1: anger and resentment. For years, Nick had been the problem child, the one who couldn't get out of his own way. But by 2023, Rob was no longer the ideal father in Nick's eyes. Nick resented his father's constant activism. He resented Rob's need for perfection. And most of all, he resented being left behind. Because Rob didn't just cut Nick off financially, he began cutting him off emotionally. He began speaking about Nick more like a liability than a son. Michelle, of course, fought to hold the family together. But there were no more family vacations. No more family days. Just more private meetings. More therapy sessions. More rejection. But was that enough to push Nick over the edge? Was the final straw really a financial issue? Maybe. But Nick wasn't stupid. He knew his inheritance would come eventually. It wasn't about the money. It was about the emotional cost. And that's where the motive gets darker. Motive 2: a third-party manipulation? What if Nick wasn't the only one with a motive? It's not uncommon for killers to be manipulated into doing things they never would have done on their own. And Nick? He was vulnerable, easily influenced. At least, that's what one confidential source claimed. Nick had been seen talking to a mysterious figure in the weeks leading up to his parents' deaths. A former associate of Rob's. Someone from Rob's political circles. Someone who had been openly critical of Rob's activism. Could this individual have fed Nick with ideas about cutting ties with his family? Could they have made Nick believe this was the only way forward? Remember, Nick was isolated, cut off from friends, struggling with addiction. It wouldn't be hard to believe someone preyed on his vulnerabilities. What if someone else had been whispering in his ear, telling him that his parents weren't worthy of his loyalty? It's a theory still under investigation, but one that holds water. Motive 3: madness. Could it be simpler than all of this? Could Nick have just lost it? For all the outward calm, all the quiet moments when he was just another man trying to get by, maybe Nick snapped. Maybe the years of frustration, disappointment, and feeling abandoned by his parents finally built up to a breaking point. One final argument over money. One final rejection from Rob. And then, with the sedatives, he was able to finally act. To do the unthinkable. Because, at its core, this wasn't just a murder. This was a reckoning. A moment when Nick believed that his world, the one that had excluded him for so long, would only make sense if he controlled the narrative. If he was finally in charge. But what's even more disturbing is that Nick's trial hasn't even started yet. Because, right now, he's locked away. But his motives, his actions, they continue to unravel in the media. And as the court case looms, more information will likely come to light. Could it be that Nick is simply too good at lying? That he's orchestrated the perfect story? Or is he truly a broken man, caught in a web of fear and manipulation? In the next chapter, we'll walk through the trial, step by step. The twists, the testimony, the climactic moment when everything changed. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming.